Now that we have the bearing fitting nicely onto our crankshaft, we can prepare the crankcase to take this new bearing by cleaning out the area where the old bearing was. It's probably full of residue, gum, carbon, varnish if you've been using a little bit of castor oil. So get a clean paper towel, give that a really good wipe out. Just as we did for the front bearing, we need to make sure that that area is spotlessly clean so that the new bearing can be seated firmly against the casting. So take whatever time you need to. You may have to add a bit of fuel to the rag or the paper towel just to get it super clean. Now we're ready to go. But just as we heated our crankcase to take the bearing out, it's a good idea to heat it again before we put the new bearing in. This ensures that it slides in easily with the minimum of fuss and bother. So take your crankcase and pop it back in the oven for another 10 minutes at 300 degrees. Well, in this case, I'm just going to use the gas torch just to heat it up quickly to save all that messing around. Now I'm just going to give it a quick blast with the gas torch. It's all done now. We use the finger test sizzle to make sure it's going to be nice and hot. Just heat it up a little bit more. And before you know it, it's nice and hot. It's expanded up to the point where the bearing should slide in nice and easily. Just a quick check with the finger. Yep, that's hot. Okay, now we take the casting in one hand and our crankshaft and bearing assembly in the other. Just drop it in. It should fit in reasonably easily. You'll see it. And you don't have to push it all the way in just yet. So grab the casting in one hand, the crankcase in one hand, and give the crankshaft a quick tug with the other. There you go. That will pull the bearing in, seat it hard against the front, and you're all done. At this stage the crankshaft can fall out. In fact, the best idea is to take it out, because in the next step what we need to do is lubricate those bearings, or at least the back one. The front one's fine. Just check them out, put your finger on, give them a twirl. They should turn smoothly, no notchiness, they shouldn't be stiff or sticky. They should turn nice and smoothly because they're brand new bearings. And to make sure they stay in good condition at the first run of the motor, it's important we put a few drops of oil in there. So before you put the crankshaft back in, just put a couple of drops of oil on the edge. Try not to get it in the actual hole in the middle, just in the edge or just where the ball bearings are. That'll provide valuable first lubrication when we go and restart the motor. Once you've got that in there, just twist the bearing a bit. That'll help it work down into the balls, and then drop your crankshaft back in. Should go in nice and smoothly, fairly easily. Drop straight through, pop out the front. There we go. Give it another twirl just to spread that oil around a bit. Now that you've got the crankshaft in there, we can actually add a few more drops of oil. In fact, get as much oil in there as you can. Any excess oil will soon be blown out when you start up the motor. Won't cause any harm, and it provides some valuable extra lubrication and protection for those bearings during the first few seconds of the operation of the engine. There you go. Distribute it as much as you can. Again, crankshaft should turn nice and smoothly. No notchiness, no stiff bits. It should just be silky smooth, just like the day you bought the motor. One other thing to do is put some oil on the crank pin. That's where the conrod's going to connect. Just a few drops of oil on there. That's one of the highest stressed parts of your engine. So it's important that it's lubricated right from the start when you've reassembled the motor. Put a few drops of oil on there, then get your piston out of your little box of bits and pieces you've been collecting. Because it's been in that box, give it a wipe. Wipe it down with your clean paper towel just to make sure there's no bits of metal or dirt that have been picked up. And then you can basically put some oil in the wrist pin or the gudgeon pin area, because this is another highly stressed part of the motor and we need that lubrication there right from the start. Put a few drops in there, give it a good wiggle, distribute the oil around. I use Mobil 1 synthetic when I'm putting engines back together, but you can use castor oil or your favourite model synthetic oil. Don't use regular mineral car oil. That can basically has so many additives you don't know what it's going to do. Once you've got those things pre-lubed, just push your piston in there. Make sure you get the conrod the right way around. Remember that little scratch? Should be visible when you drop it in. Slide the conrod down, drop the big end over the crank pin. May take a little bit of fiddling just to get it lined up. Once you get it in there, you'll feel it just drop on, nice and smooth. There you go. Now don't turn the crankshaft too much at this stage, because the piston could rattle up and down inside the casting and cause a few scratches. But what we have to do now, of course, is put the liner back in. The liner, we pulled it out before, and we need to give that a good clean too. Just as there was gum that was holding it in before and stopping the bearing going in the crankshaft, we need to get all that gum and carbon off the liner so it slides easily back in. Just clean out the inside too, in case it picked up some dirt in the little box of bits we collected. So there we are. Now we should also remember at this stage that the liner needs to be pre-lubricated so the piston can go up and down quite easily without scratching it. So put plenty of that synthetic motor oil or your favourite lubricant in there, and get a clean finger, run it up and down inside just to make sure that it's all evenly distributed. It doesn't hurt to put a few drops on the outside of the liner as well. That'll help you when you're sliding the liner back into the crankcase. Otherwise it could be a bit sticky. Remember that little mark on the front of the liner on this engine? We have to make sure it lines up with that pin. It's the little pin there that's in the casting. And if you don't have that pin and mark, then you need to ensure the exhaust ports line up with the holes in the casting. So you slide it in gently, just make sure the piston is centered in the bore, down it goes. And once you've got that little mark lined up, or the exhaust port's lined up with the hole in the casting. Then you can give it a tiny little push at the end, just snap it home, and you're done. There we go. It's all ready to go. At this stage, if you turn the crankshaft, the piston should go up and down. You see there's excess oil in the bore there just protecting it. This engine, although it's done 380 hours, still has pinch, which means I can't actually turn it right over by hand. That's quite normal for an ABC engine. They get quite tight at the top of the stroke. So now we've done that. Look in the back, see our crankshaft, conrod moving, not a problem. Next thing we need to do, of course, is put the head back on. There's the head. If it's really caked up with carbon, you can scrape some of it off with a plastic scraper. But this engine's pretty clean. So all we need to do now is just put the head screws back in, make sure the head's round the same way as when you took it off. Quite easy on this engine because you can see the caster stains on the exhaust side. Now, this engine has 6 screws. The OS 40 FX has 6 screws, the AX has 4, but just insert the screws and torque them down once you've got them all in. I torque them down in a cross pattern, so I'll do the one at say 12 o'clock, then the one at 6 o'clock, then the one at 3 and the one at 9. So you don't tighten screws that are adjacent to each other, tighten screws that are opposite to each other, and torque them down just reasonably tight. The engine, when you've done that, should still turn over reasonably smoothly if you've got a propeller on it. If you find your engine's binding up really tight, loosen all your head screws and retorque them again very carefully. Sometimes if you put too much tension on those head screws, it can distort the liner and make it hard for the piston to go up and down inside the bore. Now, of course, once you've got those head screws on, the head's all bolted down, the next thing to look at is the crankcase backplate. Remember before I asked you to be very careful with the gasket. It's important that you take care of that gasket because if that gasket leaks, then you won't have any crankcase compression. The other thing to do here is just check that the backplate is nice and clean, and check the state of that gasket. Give it a bit of a wipe with stuff on there. Notice the scoring marks on the back of that backplate. That's quite normal. That's the crank pin and the crank conrod just lightly touching the backplate when you use an electric starter. Put it back in, taking care to note that if it's got a flat, that's probably going to go at the top. Easiest way to tell if there's writing in the back of the backplate, it should be up the right way when the engine is standing with its head upwards. Put the screws back in the backplate, torque them down the same way, diagonally opposite screw, so start at the top right, then do the bottom left, and then the alternate ones as well. When you've done that, all you have to do is put the prop driver back on. It should just push back on, and it'll pull on tight when you do the prop up, and put the carburetor back on, which is just what you did when you bought the motor. Most engines come with the carburetor not fitted, so you had to do that anyway. So those are the basic steps. These are a few little reminders what you do after this. And I hope you've enjoyed this video from rcmodelreviews.com. Please visit the website. There's lots more to see there.